welcome to the deep dive. You brought us some fascinating material today on Marianburg, this really unique, free city-state kind of nestled right there within the Empire's orbit in the Warhammer world.
Yeah, and what's so compelling, I think, as the sources really highlight, is how it managed to not just survive, but actually, thrive independently, despite having these huge, powerful neighbors breathing down its neck.
Right.
So our mission today, really, is to dig into the history, the currents that allowed this anomaly almost to happen.
Absolutely. And what jumps out immediately is just the location, isn't it? Smack bang at the mouth of the River Rake.
Oh, definitely.
For thousands of years, that spot's been this crucial trade hub.
Yeah.
And inevitably a prize everyone wants. But this story goes way back, further back than the Empire itself.
It really does. Long before humans were the main players in this region, the High Elves from Ulthuan, they saw the value of that spot. They set up a pretty major fortress and dockyards there.
Okay, so we're not talking like a minor trading post. This was substantial.
Exactly. The sources call it a significantly sized elf fortress. And it was on the biggest island at the river mouth, the one we now call Rikers Island.
Right.
It was a key base for their fleets, for exploring the old world.
It's kind of wild picturing elves setting up shop right where this massive human court is now. But they didn't stick around forever, did they?
No. Thinking about the wider picture, the War of Vengeance was a massive turning point. After that whole brutal conflict, the High Elves mostly pulled back from the old world.
Right.
And Marianburg, or the place that would become Marianburg, was one of the settlements they just abandoned.
So the elves leave, and there's this prime piece of real estate just sitting there. Who moves in next?
Well, the area then gets inhabited by the Finir. The sources describe them as less hospitable creatures, kind of remnants of an older civilization living in the fens, raiding nearby settlements.
Yeah, not exactly welcoming neighbors, I guess.
Not really, no. And around the same time, you get this human tribe, the Utans, being pushed into these same fenlands.
Pushed by who?
By the Jusons, another human tribe who, interestingly, later go on to found Middenheim, way further inland.
Okay, so the Utans are basically refugees in this pretty grim territory, but it's not empty. They've got the Fimir to deal with.
Which naturally raises the question of control, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Utans ended up fighting the Fimir, first just to survive, then, to carve out more space for themselves in the marshes.
Must have been brutal fighting in that terrain.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention a really decisive battle where the Utans managed to track down and kill the Fimir queen. That basically broke the Fimir's power in the area.
Okay. Cut off the head of the snake, so to speak.
Pretty much. The Fimir scattered after that. So the victorious Utans, they established their own kingdom there, called Utenrik, and the king was named Marius.
Marius. Utenrik. You can see the connection to Marianburg.
Exactly. That's where the name comes from.
Utenrik. Still sounds kind of damp and isolated, though.
And it was. For about the next 500 years, Utenrik was just left alone, mostly. The terrain marshes, bogs, swamps. It was a fantastic natural defense.
Yeah, hard to invade.
Plus, honestly, apart from fish, there wasn't much there that anyone else really wanted. No gold, no valuable timber, just fish and swamp.
So it was off the radar for a long time. But that couldn't last forever, especially with the Empire rising, right?
Right. Eventually, Sigismund II, the conqueror, he'd had success elsewhere and turned his eyes towards Utenrik. He saw the strategic value, even then, the coastal access.
Even if it was mostly swamp, he saw the potential. Forward thinking.
Definitely. So he invades, conquers it, and incorporates Utenrik into the empire as the province of Vestland.
Vestland, okay.
And this is where things get interesting economically. Suddenly, being part of the empire gives Marianburg access to this huge internal market.
Oh, they're for fish.
Their fish become incredibly valuable almost overnight. A resource that was just local suddenly has empire-wide demand.
The power of market access. Amazing.
But it didn't stop with fish. The
Yeah.
big breakthrough was figuring out salt preservation.
Right. Keeps the fish good for longer, lets you ship it further.
Exactly. So the fishing industry booms even more. But then salt itself becomes a massive export. As the rest of the empire developed its own farms and food sources, the demand for Marianburg fish maybe leveled off a bit, but the salt. Everyone needed salt. It even overtook fish eventually.
Huh? So they adapted. First fish, then salt. Resourceful.
Very. And then, as the empire got richer overall, people started wanting luxury goods, imports from overseas.
And Marianburg being the main port.
Exactly. It became the gateway for all that exotic stuff, silks, spices, you name it. And that's when the real wealth started pouring in. immense wealth.
Okay, so this former swamp town is now swimming in gold. You just know that's going to attract the wrong kind of attention.
Absolutely predictable. All that wealth made it prime target. So in the imperial year 632, Norscan raiders sail down and sack the city.
Ouch.
Yeah. The sources point out it wasn't the first time the location had been burned, think elves, Famir, etc., but it was the first time the city called Marianburg got sacked.
You'd think that'd be a huge setback. But the Marianburgers seem to have this knack for turning bad situations around.
They really do. What's amazing is their reaction. Instead of just, rebuilding and hoping it doesn't happen again, they studied the Norscan longships. They looked at why the Norscans were so effective at sea.
Practical.
Very practical. They realized their own ships weren't really up to scratch for proper seafaring or fighting, so they decided to learn from the invaders.
Literally learning from the people who just burned your city down. That takes a certain mindset.
It does. Apparently, their first attempts at building better ships weren't great. Lots of trial and error, but they kept at it.
Persistent.
And eventually, they built a proper, effective navy. They started taking the fight to the Norscans at sea. Didn't always win, maybe, but they started hurting them, pushing back.
So going from victims to defenders, that's a big shift.
And their strategy got even smarter. They realized fighting wasn't the only option. They started offering the Norscans huge ransoms not to attack.
The diplomatic solution.
Yeah.
Well, the financial one.
Kind of, yeah. For the Norscans, often taking a big pile of gold with no risk was actually better than a risky attack on a now better defended city.
Makes sense.
But they didn't stop there. They actually started trading with the Norscans, exchanging goods. And eventually, they even got skilled Norscan shipwrights to come work in Marianburg, sharing their expertise.
Wow. From raiders to trading partners and even employees. That's quite the turnaround.
Isn't it? And with this stronger navy, built partly with Norscan know-how, Marianburg becomes the absolute hub for the Empire's overseas ambitions.
Right, the main port again.
They're setting up trade routes south to Bretonia, north to Norska itself, and then further afield Araby Cathay.
Cathay, okay, so they're really going global now.
Totally, and that just brings in even more wealth. The scale becomes astronomical.
So this small city is now a major player on the world stage, economically speaking. But all that new money, it must have changed things inside Marianburg too, right?
Yeah.
Socially, politically.
Oh, absolutely. Initially, the nobles in Marianburg weren't super wealthy. Their power was mostly tied up in things like the local salt monopoly, relatively modest compared to what came next.
Okay.
But this flood of gold from international trade, it created a new kind of nobility, much more opulent, maybe a bit decadent, the sources hint.
Flashier? Less focused on ruling and more on enjoying the profits?
Something like that. And crucially, these traditional nobles started letting commoner merchants handle the actual day-to-day running of the trade businesses. The merchants had the skills, the contacts.
Right, the expertise.
But initially, the merchants had the money, but the nobles still had the political power, mostly because they controlled the soldiers, the means of force.
So a split between economic power and political power. That sounds unstable.
It was, and the situation really came to a head during the age of the three emperors, starting around 1547. The empire's tearing itself apart in civil war.
Right, a chaotic time.
And suddenly, Marianburg's money becomes incredibly important. All of the different guys claiming to be emperor needed cash for their armies.
And the Marianburg merchants had lots of it. Leverage.
Huge leverage. They started playing the game. They'd back one claimant, then maybe another, offering loans and funds in exchange for political favors, charters, concessions.
Undermining the old nobles' power base.
Exactly. They used their gold to buy political influence, chipping away at that traditional link between nobility and power.
Smart, but ruthless.
And then came another game changer, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the High Elves.
Reconnecting with the original founders, in a way.
In a way, yes. This treaty basically opened the floodgates. Access to Ulthuan's markets, elven goods, elven ships potentially using the port. The wealth that generated supposedly dwarfed everything that had come before.
Wow. Like striking oil after you've already found gold.
Pretty much. And this cemented the merchants' position. They became so influential, they ended up getting seats on the Baron's own High Council. They weren't just influencing policy anymore, they were helping make it.
The power shift is basically complete at that point, isn't it? The merchants are running the show.
Effectively, yes. But, all this enormous wealth, it had a dark side too.
I was wondering about that. All that trade, all those ships. Perfect cover for less legitimate activities.
Definitely. The sources say Marianburg became a massive hub for piracy. The lines blurred, Legitimate merchants one day, pirates the next, maybe even using the same ships.
Sounds chaotic.
Yeah.
And corrupt. I think the material mentioned even Imperial Navy elements getting involved.
Yeah, it suggests things got really murky. Which leads us to this bizarre incident in 2344. This pirate, Otto Steinroth, the Red Pirate.
Right.
The official story is he somehow managed to raid Ulthuan itself, which seems unlikely, to say the least.
Ulthuan, with all its defenses.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds suspicious.
Highly suspicious. The sources really question that narrative. They hint maybe Sea Lord Aislinn, the elf commander who responded, had his own reasons for what happened next.
Which was?
Well, Aislinn follows the pirates back to Marianburg, and then he attacks the city. A full-on assault.
Attacks Marianburg. An imperial city, technically. An ally of the elves through the treaty.
Exactly. It was hugely controversial, even back in Ulthuan. Aislinn's Sea Guard hit the city hard, despite its defenses. They targeted suspected pirate ships, executed Steinroth on the spot, grabbed some high elf merchants who were living in Marianburg, and burned the port down. Again.
Man, that port just can't catch a break. So, another sacking, this time by supposed allies.
Yeah.
What was the fallout?
Well, right around the same time, adding to the chaos, the Baron of Marianburg, Pallas Vandermock, dies fighting in the Great War against Chaos.
Okay.
And he dies without an heir. Big problem.
Uh-oh. A rich city, recently attacked, now leaderless. That's going to attract attention.
You bet. Middenheim, Talbot-Clan, Nordland, all these powerful imperial provinces immediately put in claims for Marianburg.
A feeding frenzy. What did the Emperor Magnus the Pious want?
Magnus was wary. He didn't want any one of those provinces getting too powerful by grabbing Marianburg. He preferred a minor noble, someone easier to manage. But with so many big players making claims, it looked like it could spark another civil war within the empire.
Right when they're dealing with chaos. Bad timing. So, how did they resolve it? Or did they?
This is where the merchants make their move. The big, wealthy merchant houses go to Magnus with a proposal. They say, look, things are unstable. Let us administer the city for you temporarily. We'll collect the taxes for the empire, keep things running smoothly, while you find a suitable, noble heir.
Oh, that sounds helpful.
Cool.
And incredibly self-serving. Did Magnus buy it?
The sources say he was very suspicious. He knew what they were likely up to, but the alternative was probably war, a war the empire couldn't afford.
So he gambled.
He gambled. He agreed to their temporary administration, hoping he could sort it out later and put an imperial noble back in charge eventually.
Famous last words territory, maybe.
Pretty much. The merchants, now in charge, immediately started consolidating power. First thing they asked Magnus for, the right to raise their own private armies.
The justification being?
Defense. Against pirates, raiders, like the ones who just attacked. Given what happened with Aislinn, it probably seemed reasonable to Magnus, or at least hard to refuse publicly.
Okay, so the merchants get their own troops. Step one to independence.
And they used them effectively, kept the trade routes secure, defended the city, they proved they could handle it, so they got permission to keep those armies permanently.
Right.
Then they went further. They offered to take over the maintenance and even the command of the imperial fleet that was based in Marianburg Harbor.
Using imperial resources. Clever. And Magnus agreed.
Seems so. Maybe he thought it saved the empire money, or maybe he was just too distracted by other wars. But the result was the merchants now controlled the local land and sea forces.
The balance of power is just gone at this point.
Completely. From there, they gradually took over everything else. Law enforcement, local laws, and crucially, tax collection. More and more of the city's revenue started staying in Marianburg's coffers, not going to the emperor.
A slow coup. Almost.
Yeah.
Done with contracts and administration.
Until, finally, under a leader called Wilhelm the Wise, while the empire was busy fighting yet another war somewhere else, Marianburg just declared independence, formally seceded.
Just like that. How did the empire react this time? Surely they didn't just let it go.
Oh, they tried. They sent 3 different imperial armies to take the city back by force.
Bruh.
All 3 were defeated. Marianburg's fortifications were too strong. Its navy, built with all that wealth, controlled the sea and the river mouth. They could blockade the Reich, crippling imperial trade. It was basically impregnable.
They'd built themselves into a fortress the empire couldn't crack, using the empire's own neglect, in a way.
Exactly. Plus, they still had that treaty with the High Elves. If things got really desperate, they could potentially call for elven aid.
A powerful insurance policy.
So, faced with military failure and the potential complications, the empire eventually just gave up. They formally recognized Marianburg's independence. Grudgingly, I'm sure, but they did it. They were still allowed to trade there, at least.
Wow. So Marianburg pulled it off. It actually broke away and stayed away. What's it like now in the modern Warhammer era?
Well, it's governed by this really complex system. Conclaves, councils, committees, made up of merchants, politicians, some remaining nobles, clergy especially, priests of Manan, the sea god, he's very important there.
Sounds bureaucratic.
Mm-hmm.
And probably full of infighting.
Oh, almost certainly. It's a place where wealth is king. The richest merchant families are practically above the law. There's also this interesting tendency to value foreigners, experts from elsewhere, sometimes more than their own people, dedicated foreign quarters, different languages spoken in different districts. It's not purely Reichsspiel anymore.
A real melting pot, but one ruled by gold.
Pretty much. And underneath the surface, you've got constant maneuvering. Trade houses plotting against each other, guilds fighting for influence, criminal gangs, pirates still lurking. It's a viper's nest in some ways.
Doesn't sound great for the average person living there.
Probably not. The sources suggest conditions for ordinary folk might actually be worse now than under the Empire, in some respects. But for the merchant elite, they're living large. Minimal regulation, huge profits.
And they use that wealth to maintain power.
Absolutely. They fund a very well-equipped army and navy. They've even got things like steam tanks, land ships, cutting-edge imperial tech, ironically.
So it's become a real power in its own right, not just rich, but militarily capable.
Definitely. Capable of defending itself against most threats. And its position is kind of secured by its neighbors, too.
How so?
Well, think about it. Would Bretonnia want the Empire to suddenly conquer Marienburg and control all that trade and coastline? Probably not. Would the Empire want Bretonnia to grab it? Definitely not.
So it's valuable enough that the big players almost prefer it stays independent, acting as a buffer and a trade hub they can all access.
Exactly. It's in their mutual self-interest in a weird way to keep Marienburg free. So a return to the Empire seems incredibly unlikely. They learned from the Empire's mistakes, you see. The Empire lost Marienburg partly through neglect and internal division. The merchants running Marienburg now are probably very careful not to make those same mistakes themselves.
So quite a story. From an elven fort to a swamp kingdom, an imperial province, and now this independent powerhouse. It really shows how trade, location, and just sheer opportunism can change everything.
Yeah, the key takeaway really is how economic power combined with that strategic position and a real knack for adaptation allowed this relatively small place to defy expectations, challenge an empire, and carve out its own destiny. Wealth really can reshape politics.
It certainly did here. But looking at it now, ruled by money, full of internal conflict, potentially harsh for its ordinary citizens. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How sustainable is that independence in the really long run? Especially if a major unified external threat emerged, one that didn't care about trade rules. What happens when pure military power ignores the power of gold? What vulnerabilities does that kind of government have?